The dress was the color of old cream and heartbreak, and every single person on Platform 3 of the Abilene depot went silent the moment Celia Collins stepped off the train. She had not planned it this way. She had not planned any of this. But when the telegram arrived 3 days after her mother's funeral, the telegram from a man she had never met, a man named Gerald Hatch who had paid for her passage west with a money order and a single line that read, "Arrive by the 15th or forfeit the arrangement." She had been standing in her mother's bedroom with nowhere to go and nothing left to wear. Her own trunk had been repossessed along with the furniture. The dress had been hanging there on the back of the wardrobe door, luminous and still as if it had been waiting for her. So she put it on, and she got on the train. And now she stood on the platform in Abilene, Kansas in August of 1873, wearing ivory silk and hand-stitched lace that belonged to a dead woman, with a carpet bag in one hand and a folded letter in the other, and there was no Gerald Hatch anywhere in sight. People stared. A woman pressed her hand to her mouth. Two cowboys near the water trough elbowed each other. A child pointed, and her mother pulled the child's hand down and whispered something sharp. The sun was ferocious. The platform smelled of coal smoke and horse, and the particular loneliness of places where people are always arriving and almost never staying. Celia did not move. She stood in the center of all of it, and she lifted her chin and she breathed, because the only thing she had left that Gerald Hatch could not take from her was the air in her lungs and the way she chose to use it. That was when she felt it, a shadow falling over her from the left. Not urgent, not invasive. Just present, the way a tree is present when you are standing in the sun for too long. She turned. The man standing there was tall enough that he blocked a meaningful portion of the sky. He had dark hair pushed back under a battered hat, jaw shadowed with several days of beard, and eyes the color of weathered oak, not brown, not green, something in between that seemed to be deciding. He was wearing a canvas duster over a plain work shirt, and there was a marshal's badge pinned to his vest that caught the light when he breathed. He looked at her. Not the way the others looked at her, with amusement or pity or uncomfortable fascination. He looked at her as if she were simply a person who had arrived, and arriving was a thing he understood. He said nothing. He reached up, shrugged the duster off his shoulders in one unhurried motion, and held it out to her. Celia Collins stared at that coat for a long moment. Then she looked up at Emmett Conroy's face. His expression did not change. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was the particular kind of respect that does not require explanation. She took the coat. She did not say thank you right away. She did not know how to, not in that moment, not when the weight of the coat settling around her shoulders felt like the first solid thing in 3 weeks. And that, though she could not have known it then, was where everything truly began. 6 months earlier, Celia Collins had been living a life of compressed dignity in a narrow house in Cincinnati, Ohio, that smelled of beeswax and camphor and her mother's lavender water. Her mother, Abilene Collins, had been ill for 2 years with a consumption that worked slowly and methodically, the way ruin always does when it intends to be thorough. Celia had nursed her, had sold her own piano lessons to keep the coal bin full and the creditors patient, had sat beside that bed through 8 seasons of decline until Abilene Collins finally let go on a Tuesday in July. And then the creditors stopped being patient. The house had been leased. The furniture had been pledged against a debt Celia had not known existed, a loan her mother had taken from a man named Aldous Hatch, who was now dead, and whose son Gerald had inherited both the money-lending business and an apparently insatiable appetite for collecting on what he was owed. Gerald Hatch had appeared at the house 4 days after Aline's death with a ledger and a proposition. Celia could lose everything and have nothing, or she could become a bride. His business partner in Abilene needed a wife. The man was a landowner, Gerald said, successful, respectable. He was willing to pay passage and forgive the debt entirely in exchange for the arrangement. It was, Gerald explained with the flat courtesy of a man who had made this kind of offer before, a sensible solution. Celia had looked at him across the stripped parlor and thought about all the things she could say. She thought about pride. She thought about her mother's hands, how they had looked in the last weeks, thin and paper pale against the quilt. She thought about the $73 she had hidden in the heel of a boot, which would last her perhaps 40 days in Cincinnati without a home or a position. She said she would consider it. She spent 2 days walking the streets of Cincinnati, thinking. She was 24 years old. She had educated herself on the sly, reading her mother's books when her mother thought she was sleeping, learning enough Latin to understand what the doctors were saying and enough arithmetic to know exactly how desperate the finances were. She was not afraid of work. She was not afraid of a new place. She was afraid, she realized, of surrendering the last of herself to a man she had never met, as if she were a parcel being redirected. But she was more afraid of having no direction at all. She sent Gerald Hatch a letter agreeing to the arrangement and requesting the name of the man she was to marry. Gerald's reply came back in 3 days. The name was Theodore Greer. He was 41 years old. He owned a cattle operation outside Abilene. He was, Gerald assured her, a man of his word. What Gerald did not mention, what Celia would not discover until she was already on the train, already past the point of easy return, was that Theodore Greer had a reputation in Abilene that had nothing to do with being a man of his word. But that was still in the future. On the morning she left Cincinnati, she had gone to her mother's room one last time. The room was empty now, stripped to bare boards and plaster. The only thing remaining was the wedding dress, which Celia Collins had worn when she married a man named Charles Collins in 1847, and which she had kept wrapped in muslin and cedar in the wardrobe for 26 years, with an instruction that it was never to be sold. Celia's own traveling dress had been taken with the trunk the previous afternoon, when a creditor's man came to collect on a debt she had not known about until that morning. She stood in the bare room in her underclothes with 40 minutes until her train and a carpet bag that held 2 changes of linen, her mother's Bible, a tortoiseshell comb, and the $73. She looked at the dress. The dress looked back at her. She thought briefly of what her mother would say. Celia Collins had been a practical woman underneath all the lavender water, and Celia suspected she would say something like, "A dress is cloth, Celia. Cloth has never stopped a train." So Celia put on her mother's wedding dress and she walked to the depot and she got on the train heading west, and she felt the whole time like she was wearing something she had not yet earned but could not afford to refuse. The journey took 4 days. She sat in the passenger car and watched Ohio become Indiana, become Illinois, become the great open prairie of Kansas, and the further west the train went the wider the sky became, until it felt like the world was being pulled apart at the seams to show her something enormous and unfinished underneath. She ate the food she had packed. She did not speak to anyone. She kept the carpet bag on her lap and her mother's Bible open on top of it, though she was not always reading it. Sometimes she was just looking at Celia Collins's handwriting in the margins, small and precise and utterly characteristic, and feeling the particular way grief sits in your chest when you are traveling away from everything that held it. She arrived in Abilene on the 15th of August. There was no Theodore Greer on the platform. There was no one from the Greer operation at all. She waited 30 minutes. She checked the letter again. Platform 3, Abilene Depot, August 15, 1873. This was Platform 3. This was Abilene. This was August 15th, and that was when the staring began. Because she had been sitting in the train car and not noticed how she looked, had forgotten entirely in the anxiety of arriving that she was wearing a wedding dress in public, and now she was standing on a platform in the full afternoon sun in ivory silk and Belgian lace, and the entire depot seemed to have come to a collective, appalled halt. She lifted her chin. She breathed. She waited. And then Emmett Conroy's shadow fell across her and he said nothing, and he handed her his coat. Celia pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders and looked at the man who had given it to her. He was watching the platform with the habitual, unhurried attention of someone who had learned to watch without appearing to. the kind of attention she associated with schoolteachers and lawmen, and people who had been surprised badly once, and were determined never to be surprised again. The badge said U.S. Marshal. He looked maybe 30, maybe 32. It was difficult to tell because the sun and the work had done something interesting to his face that was not aging so much as seasoning. "I am looking for Theodore Greer," Celia said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Or anyone sent by him." Emmett Conroy turned to look at her then, not quick, not alarmed, deliberate. "How do you know Greer?" he said. The way he said it made something cold run down the back of her neck. "I have an arrangement with him," she said carefully. "A business arrangement. I was told to arrive today." Emmett looked at her for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "What kind of arrangement?" "A marital one," Celia said, because there was no point in softening it. "I was informed he needed a wife. I agreed to come. Now I am here and he is not, and I would appreciate knowing whether that is a cause for concern or simply a cause for irritation." Emmett was quiet. He looked away from her, back toward the end of the platform where the street began, and she could see something working in his face that he was keeping well controlled. "Where are you from, Miss Collins?" "Celia Collins, Cincinnati," he nodded slowly. "Miss Collins, do you have somewhere to stay tonight, apart from the Greer property?" That cold thing on the back of her neck became a solid weight. "What are you not telling me, Marshal?" He looked at her again. Those oak-colored eyes were direct and careful and not unkind. "Theodore Greer was arrested 4 days ago," he said. "I'm the one who arrested him." The platform seemed to tilt slightly. Celia pressed her feet flat against the boards to steady herself. "On what charge?" "Land fraud," Emmett said. "And mail fraud, which likely includes whatever arrangement he made with you." She absorbed this. The silk dress felt suddenly very elaborate and very wrong, a costume for a scene that was never going to be performed. She thought about the $73 in her carpet bag, which had become $61 and some change after 4 days of train food. She thought about Cincinnati, which was 4 days behind her and held nothing for her anymore. She thought about Gerald Hatch, who had sent her here knowing, he must have known, the debt and the arrangement were too neat not to have been deliberate, knowing she would arrive to nothing. She thought about the dark past that seemed to follow every plan she had ever made, turning it to smoke before she could get close enough to hold it. "I see," she said. "Is there family you can wire?" Emmett asked. "No. Money enough for a hotel, temporarily." He studied her face. She studied his. There was a negotiation happening between them that involved no words at all. The kind of negotiation that happens when two people who are used to managing alone recognize the same quality in each other. "There is a boarding house on Elm Street," he said finally. "Mrs. Aldridge runs it. She is a decent woman. I can walk you there if you would like and see to it that you are settled." Celia considered this. "And your coat, Marshal?" Something shifted very slightly in his face. Not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. "You can return it when you are settled." Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house was 3 blocks from the depot, along a street that smelled of horses and hot dust, and the particular mineral sharpness of the Kansas summer. Emmett Conroy walked beside her at a distance that was respectful without being pointed, and she was aware the whole time of how she must look a woman in a wedding dress with a carpet bag, walking beside a marshal through the main street of Abilene, and she decided that caring about it would require more energy than she had to spare. He did not try to make conversation. She appreciated this. Most men, she had found, responded to awkward situations by filling them with noise. Emmett Conroy seemed to understand that silence could be a form of courtesy. Mrs. Aldridge turned out to be a compact, gray-haired woman of about 55 who had clearly seen enough of life not to be startled by a woman in a wedding dress arriving with a marshal. She looked at Celia's dress, looked at Emmett, and said to Celia, "Room's $2 a week, meals included. You look like you need a meal." Emmett Conroy paid the first week. Celia opened her mouth to object, and he met her eyes and said simply, "The fraudulent arrangement was in part a federal matter. Consider it restitution." She could argue with that. She decided not to, not today, not when she was swaying slightly on her feet from 4 days of train travel, and the particular exhaustion of having her life restructured around her without her permission. That night, alone in the small, clean room that smelled of cedar and dried lavender, as if even here her mother was close, Celia sat on the edge of the bed in her petticoat and held the wedding dress in her lap and thought carefully about her situation. She was in Abilene, Kansas. She had no employment, no connections, no plan, and approximately $60. She had a carpet bag, a Bible, a comb, and a coat that belonged to a marshal named Emmett Conroy. She also had, she reminded herself, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, the only thing that had never been taken from her. She folded the dress and wrapped it in the paper that had lined her bag and put it at the bottom of the carpet bag where it would be safe. Then she lay down on the clean bed and slept for 10 hours without moving. The next morning she returned the coat. She had asked Mrs. Aldridge where to find the marshal's office, and the woman had given her directions with the efficient brevity of someone who knew the town like the inside of her own hand. The office was on First Street, a low stone building with a hitching post and a window that had been repaired so many times it had developed a complex personality of mismatched glass panes. She knocked. "Come in," said Emmett's voice. He was sitting behind a desk that was organized with military precision, reading a document. He looked up when she came in and she placed the coat on the corner of his desk without preamble. "Thank you," she said, "for yesterday and for the room." He nodded. "Are you settled?" "I am making plans," she said, which was different but sounded better. "I wanted to ask you something if you have a moment." He sat back in his chair and waited. That quality of attention again, unhurried and complete, as if whatever she was about to say had his full weight behind it. "Is there work to be found here?" she asked. "I am educated. I can teach, keep accounts, manage correspondence. I can also cook and sew, though I mention those second because they are less interesting to me, and I have found that work you find tedious is work you eventually do badly." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile still, but closer. "There's a schoolhouse on Cedar Street," he said. "Had a teacher leave in May. The town council has been advertising since June with limited success." "Why limited success?" "Abilene is still building itself," he said. "The cattle trade brings money, but it also brings trouble, and teachers with credentials have more comfortable options." "I am not particularly interested in comfortable," Celia said. "I am interested in employment." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely decode, something between assessment and something quieter and harder to name. "I can give you the name of the council chairman," he said. "Ephraim Wade. He's at the hardware store most mornings." "Thank you," she said. She turned to leave. "Miss Collins," he said. She stopped. "The man who sent you here, Gerald Hatch. Do you know him well?" She turned back. "Enough to know he is not a man of conscience." "He was my mother's creditor. The arrangement he offered was presented as my only way out of a debt I had not incurred." Emmett's face did something careful and contained. "Gerald Hatch is associated with Theodore Greer in ways we are still untangling. There may be federal questions that involve your testimony. I want you to know that." "I understand," she said. "I will not run." "I didn't think you would," he said. She left the office and walked to the hardware store on 2nd Street and introduced herself to Ephraim Wade, who was a round-faced man in his 50s with flour dust on his apron that seemed to have nothing to do with hardware. And she told him she was a qualified teacher seeking the schoolhouse position. Wade looked her over with the cautious optimism of a man who had been disappointed before, and asked her 3 questions about pedagogy that she answered with precision and some impatience. And by the end of the conversation, he had agreed to present her to the town council at their Thursday meeting. The council hired her on Friday. The school term would begin in September. In the meantime, she had a room, she had the anticipation of income, and she had $60 and the particular fierce satisfaction of a plan that was beginning, imperfectly and against resistance, to form. What she did not have was any understanding of what to do with the fact that she kept thinking about Emmett Conroy. She told herself it was gratitude. The coat, the boarding house, the referral. It was reasonable to think about a person who had been unexpectedly decent to you. It did not mean anything else. She also told herself more honestly at 2 in the morning when the boarding house was quiet and the summer heat pressed down on everything like a hand, that she was being foolish. She knew nothing about the man except that he wore a badge and had good instincts and gave his coat to a stranger on a platform without requiring explanation or thanks. She did not know his history. She did not know his secrets, and a man with that quality of controlled watchfulness almost certainly had secrets. She also did not know why he had been at the depot in the first place. She was a naturally curious woman. Her mother had called it one of her better faults, and the question bothered her until she finally, a week later, asked him. She had been walking back from the schoolhouse, which she had spent 2 days cleaning and reorganizing with the energetic authority of a person who finally had something to be authorized about, and she ran into Emmett near the corner of First and Cedar. He was coming out of the telegraph office with a folded paper in his hand and a look on his face that suggested the paper's contents were not good news. "Marshal," she said. "Miss Collins," he said. He tucked the paper into his shirt pocket. "How is the schoolhouse?" "Coming along," she said. "I wanted to ask you, when you were at the depot the day I arrived, were you there because of me, because of the Greer case?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "We had information that Greer was expecting a mail-order bride from Cincinnati. We didn't know who you were or what you'd been told, but I was there in case." "In case of what?" He met her eyes. "In case Greer had associates meeting the train who intended to use you as leverage while he was in custody." The implications of this settled around her like sediment. "Did he have associates?" "Yes," Emmett said, "but they didn't show. Whether they saw me first or decided it wasn't worth the trouble, I don't know." Celia absorbed this carefully. "So I was potentially in danger and you did not tell me." "I didn't want to frighten you until I knew whether there was something to be frightened of," he said. "By the time I was reasonably certain there wasn't, you were already at Mrs. Aldridge's, and I judged that alarming you retroactively would not serve any useful purpose." "That is a reasonable judgment," she said. "I am not certain I agree with it entirely, but it is reasonable." He nodded. He seemed to accept her assessment with neither defensiveness nor excessive apology, and that, she thought, was either the behavior of a man of genuine self-possession or a man so accustomed to being right that disagreement simply bounced off him. She was not yet sure which. "I will need a formal statement from you about the Hatch arrangement," he said. "When you are ready. There is no urgency, but the U.S. Attorney will want testimony for the case." "I can come tomorrow morning," she said. He looked faintly surprised. "Tomorrow morning is fine." She gave her statement the next morning, sitting across the desk from him in the stone office with its complicated windows, and she was precise and thorough and did not perform distress she did not feel. She told him everything. The debt, Gerald Hatch, the proposition, the letter, the telegram about the dress and the trunk being taken, the money order for passage. She told him all of it, and he wrote it down, and he did not interrupt her, and he did not offer her any of the comforting diminishments that men sometimes offer women in official situations. "I'm sure it wasn't as bad as all that, and you must have been terribly confused," that she had always found both insulting and unnecessary. When she finished, he looked up from his notes. "You said your trunk was taken the day before you left, by a creditor's man." "Yes." "Was that the only reason you wore the dress?" She looked at him. He was asking carefully, the way he did everything, and his face held something that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but seemed to exist at the exact border between the two. "No," she said honestly. "I wore it because it was the only thing left that was hers, and I was leaving everything I had left behind." He said nothing, but something in his face acknowledged what she had said in a way that felt more sincere than most of the condolences she had received after Celia Collins died. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said finally. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was curious, and because it seemed like the kind of office where directness was the appropriate currency, "Have you lost someone?" A pause. "My brother," he said, 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said. The quality of the silence between them shifted then. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people have accidentally shown each other something real, something they had not necessarily intended to share, and the question is whether they will retreat from it or let it stand. They let it stand. September came, and with it 22 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and Celia's classroom became the center of her days. She was a good teacher. She had known she would be. She had always understood that her particular combination of impatience with ignorance and genuine delight in a mind opening up were the precise qualities good teaching required. She was demanding and fair and occasionally very funny, and the children responded to this, the way children respond to teachers who are genuinely interested in them, which is to say with the kind of wholehearted effort that looks like devotion. She also, in the evenings, began to know the town. Mrs. Aldridge's dining table was a source of considerable information, and she used it well. She learned who was reliable and who was not, which businesses were honest and which were not, where the dangers lived, and where the ordinary life of the place went on underneath the noise of the cattle trade. Abilene in 1873 was a town in transition. The great herds that had made it famous were beginning to move further west as the railways expanded, and the rougher element that had followed the cattle was being gradually, not without conflict, replaced by a different kind of settler. Family, churches, schools. The West was not taming itself, she observed. It was being tamed in increments by women and teachers and clergymen and legislators, and the process was loud and resistant and occasionally dangerous. But it was happening. She saw Emmett regularly, which was perhaps inevitable in a town of Abilene's size, but she found that she looked for him when she did not, which she admitted to herself with the honest acknowledgement that it was probably significant. He was thorough in his work and people trusted him, not easily or automatically the way they trust institutions, but the harder way, the way that comes from watching a person do difficult things consistently well over time. She heard stories. The rancher whose stolen cattle he recovered. The family he had managed to protect when a dispute over water rights turned ugly. The time, 2 years before, when he had walked into the Long Branch alone to talk a man with a shotgun out of using it, and had come back out with the shotgun and a bruised jaw, and had filed his report and gone home without telling anyone how bad it had come close to being. She also heard that he had been engaged once, to a woman from Wichita named Rachel Harmon, and that she had gone back east without explanation in the spring of 1871, and that he had not spoken of it since. She was not sure what to do with this information except note it and file it in the place where she kept things she was still thinking about. October brought the first real cold, the kind that drops on the Kansas plains without warning and makes everything feel suddenly urgent and provisional. Celia bought heavier wool at the dry goods store and made herself a practical coat that was nothing like the wedding dress, which was still wrapped in paper at the bottom of the carpet bag which was now under her bed. She had not looked at it since August. On a Thursday evening in mid-October, Emmett appeared at Mrs. Aldridge's front door and asked to speak with Celia if she was available. Mrs. Aldridge, who had long since noticed the pattern of the marshal's casual appearances in the vicinity of her most interesting boarder, let him in with an expression of dignified neutrality that fooled no one. Celia came down the stairs in her everyday dress, her hair pinned back from a long day of teaching, with chalk dust on her sleeve that she noticed and was not able to do anything about. "There has been a development in the Greer case," Emmett said, standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands. "Gerald Hatch was arrested in Cincinnati last week. His attorney has made contact with the U.S. Attorney's office here to negotiate. Part of the negotiation involves the debt he claimed you owed." Celia sat down. "What kind of negotiation?" "He is offering to produce documentation that would formally cancel the debt in exchange for a reduced charge. The U.S. Attorney will likely accept. The formal cancellation would mean the money he claimed was owed to his father's estate is legally dissolved. You would not owe it. You would never have owed it." She was quiet for a moment. "He fabricated it." The documentation he has suggests the original debt was repaid by your mother in 1868. He falsified the ledger after her death. The heat of anger was immediate and clean, like a struck match. She had known, in the way you know things you are not quite ready to look at directly, that there was something wrong about the debt's timing, but fabricated. After Abilene Collins was dead and past defending herself. He used my mother's death, Celia said. He waited until she was gone and then he invented the debt and used it to coerce me. Yes, Emmett said. There was nothing soft about the way he said it. He gave her the full weight of it because she had earned the right to carry it accurately. She sat with it. She thought about the bare room in Cincinnati, the stripped parlor, the dress hanging on the back of the wardrobe door. She thought about Gerald Hatch's flat courtesy and his ledger and his proposition that had been neither sensible nor a solution but a trap. She thought about how entirely she had walked into it with her eyes open because her eyes had not been given enough light to see by. "Is there anything I need to do?" she said finally. "Sign a statement affirming your account of the arrangement. The attorney will handle the rest." "I will sign it tomorrow morning," she said. Emmett nodded. He turned his hat in his hands once, which was the first time she had seen him do anything that looked like nervousness. "There is one other thing," he said. "Tell me." "Theodore Greer's associates, the ones who didn't meet the train. We've had reason to believe in the last week that one of them has been watching you." The match heat of anger became something cooler and more focused. "Watching me. He may have been told by Greer that you have information that could be used against him. Which is not true, but criminals operating on bad information are more dangerous, not less, because they act on what they believe rather than what exists." "Who is it?" "A man named Cole Decker. He's known to us. Small-time enforcer, works for hire. He may just be watching to assess whether you're a threat and leave it at that, or he may not." "And you are telling me this," Celia said steadily, "because you believe I deserve to know." "Yes," Emmett said, "and because I want to ask your permission to keep a closer eye on your movements for a while, not intrusive, just present." She looked at him. The parlor was small and warm, and Mrs. Aldridge had put a vase of late-season chrysanthemums on the mantel, orange and rust and gold, and Emmett Conroy was standing in the middle of it all with his hat in his hands, asking her permission for something he could have simply done without asking, because he was that kind of man. Because permission meant something to him. "Yes," she said. "You may." Something in his face settled. "I'll walk past the schoolhouse at noon and end of day," he said. "If you see anything that troubles you before that, don't wait." "I won't," she said. He turned to go and she said, "Emmett." He stopped. She had not used his given name before. He turned back and his face was very careful, the way a surface is careful when something beneath it is moving. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, for asking." He nodded once. "Good night, Miss Collins," he said. "Good night, Marshal," she said. The next 2 weeks were taught with a particular kind of awareness that Celia found exhausting and clarifying in equal measure. She went about her days teaching, walking, managing the ordinary business of living with the background knowledge that she was possibly being watched, and she found that this knowledge, rather than making her smaller, made her more deliberate. She paid attention to the street. She learned the faces of Abilene the way she had learned the map of Cincinnati, until she could tell the usual from the unusual at a glance. She did not see Cole Decker, but she felt the quality of the surveillance twice, once near the dry goods store on a Tuesday, and once near the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon, the particular sensing of eyes that does not announce itself but lives in the spine. On the Friday, she kept walking and did not look around, and 20 minutes later Emmett was at her door with the focused restraint of a man who had been moving fast and was not going to let it show. "You felt it," he said. "Near the schoolhouse. End of day, I didn't see him." "I did," Emmett said. "He was at the corner of Cedar and 2nd. He's gone now." "What do you intend to do?" "Bring him in for questioning," he said. "I have enough to hold him temporarily." "I wanted to tell you before you heard about it another way." "You are very consistent about telling me things directly," she said. "It seems more respectful," he said. She looked at him in the hallway of Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house and thought, not for the first time, about the Rachel Harmon from Wichita who had gone back east without explanation. She thought about what kind of dark past a man accumulates when he spends years in service of a law that is still being invented in a place where violence is an ordinary language. She thought about the secrets he kept behind those oak-colored eyes, and whether they were the kind that protected others, or the kind that simply protected himself. She decided she wanted to know which. "Marshal," she said, "I would like to have supper with you sometime. Not tonight because I believe you have things to do, but sometime." The stillness in his face was absolute for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "I would like that," he said. "Sometime." Cole Decker was brought in the following morning, held for 2 days, and released with a warning that would not survive another incident. The threat was not entirely eliminated. Emmett was honest with her about this. But it was reduced, and Greer's operation was being methodically dismantled by the federal case, which meant Decker's employer and his employer's money were becoming less reliable sources of income. The incentive to press the matter was weakening. Celia thought about hidden motives. She thought about how many of the arrangements of her life had been shaped by forces operating behind the obvious ones. Gerald Hatch's fabricated ledger, Greer's fraud, the careful misdirection of people with money and plans for people without either. She thought about what it meant to live clearly, to see things as they were rather than as they were presented. It seemed to her that this was the central discipline of survival, more important than courage, more important than strength, because without it courage and strength had no accurate target. November arrived with a blue cold that settled over the plains like something that meant to stay. The cattle trade was quiet now, the drives finished for the season, and Abilene had contracted into its winter self, smaller and more local, the noise of the summer replaced by the sound of wind against wood and the muffled percussion of boots on frozen ground. Celia liked it better. She was a woman who preferred things in their actual proportions to things inflated by season and commerce, and Abilene in winter showed her what it actually was, a town with good bones and serious intentions, still finding its shape. She and Emmett had supper together the first Friday of November at the hotel dining room, which was the most proper establishment in town, and the one that seemed, by some regional consensus, to be where adults in Abilene went when they intended for something to mean something. She wore her brown wool dress, which was practical and well-made and the best she currently owned. She had put her mother's pearl brooch at the collar, which was her one piece of jewelry, and which Celia Collins had worn every day for as long as Celia could remember. Emmett was there before her. He stood when she came in, which was habit with him rather than performance, and he was wearing a clean shirt and had shaved, and the badge was absent from his vest for the first time she could recall, and the absence of it changed something subtle about the geography of him. He looked like what he was underneath the official identity, a man. Just a man, sitting in a hotel dining room in November, waiting for a woman he wanted to talk to. They ate beef and potatoes and talked for 2 hours. She told him about Cincinnati in a way she had not told anyone, not just the facts of it but the texture, the narrow house and the lavender water and her mother's voice, and what it had been like to watch someone you loved become smaller by degrees until there was not enough of them left to hold the illness back. He listened the way she had come to understand he listened to everything, without filling the spaces, without redirecting towards something more comfortable. In return, he told her about his brother, whose name was James. James Conroy had come west 2 years before Emmett had, following the railroad work, and had been killed in a dispute over wages between a contractor and a crew that Emmett had not been able to get to in time. He had been 26. Emmett had been 29. He was 32 now, which confirmed her estimate, and the 3 years since James's death had left their marks in the controlled watchfulness that she had noticed from the platform and had been trying to understand ever since. "You came out here because of him," she said. "Partly," he said. "I had reasons of my own as well, but yes, I wanted to understand the place that took him." I thought if I understood it well enough I could do something useful in it. And do you, she said, find it useful? He thought about this seriously. I think I've prevented some harm, he said. I'm not certain it balances what was already done, but I don't know that balancing is the right measure. What is the right measure? She asked. He looked at her across the table with the oak-colored eyes that were doing something she had not seen them do before, something open and slightly uncertain, the expression of a man who does not often allow himself to be uncertain in front of another person. I think it might be whether the work is honest, he said. Whether you do it for the right reasons, even when the outcomes don't cooperate. She thought about this for a long time afterward. December brought snow, and with the snow came a quality of stillness that Celia found unexpectedly beautiful. The plains in winter had a particular kind of severity that she associated with honesty. They gave you nothing they did not have, made no claims they could not support, and the sky above them in the cold was a blue so deep and clear it looked like something you could put your hand through. She and Emmett were spending time together with the regularity that, in a town the size of Abilene, constituted a kind of public declaration. Mrs. Aldridge watched this development with visible satisfaction and made no comment because she was also a woman who understood that commentary was not always the most useful contribution a person could make. The town formed its opinion and expressed it, as towns do, through the particular attention paid to two people when they are seen together versus when they are seen apart. Celia was aware of all of this and found that she did not mind it the way she had expected to. She had always been a private person. The compressed dignity of the narrow house had made her one, but privacy was different from secrecy, and what she felt when she was with Emmett Conroy was nothing she had any need to hide. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way she knew useful things, directly and without excessive drama, the way she knew that water was cold and that grief was patient, and that some distances, once crossed, cannot be fully uncrossed. She was falling in love with a man who gave his coat to a stranger on a platform and asked permission before protecting her, and listened to everything she said as if it mattered and cried for his brother in the only way men like him cry, which is by being quietly and perpetually insufficient to their own grief. She was not sure what he felt. She had evidence, but it was the kind of evidence that suggested without confirming, the particular attentiveness when she spoke, the way he positioned himself between her and anything that might be a threat without making a production of it. The Friday suppers at the hotel dining room that had become as reliable as the school schedule. The way he had, once, when she was laughing at something he said about a chicken that had wandered into the marshal's office and refused to be collected, looked at her with an expression so unguarded and warm that she had almost said something she was not ready to say. She decided she needed more information. She got it on the Sunday before Christmas. She had been walking back from the church service, which she attended for the community of it rather than the theology, though she was not hostile to the theology either, and Emmett fell into step beside her on 2nd Street because they were going in the same direction, and the pretense that this was coincidental had become so thin that they had tacitly agreed to stop maintaining it. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "The woman from Wichita," she said. She was not a person who approached things from behind when the front was available. "Rachel Harmon, what happened?" He walked half a block before he answered. The snow had been packed into the street by wagon traffic and it crunched under their feet with a rhythmic precision. "She decided that the work was too dangerous," he said, "and that I would never leave it. She was probably right on both counts." "Did you ask her to stay?" Another half block. "I asked her to give me a month to make a decision about whether to transfer east. I thought I was being measured about it. She thought I was asking her to wait while I chose the badge over her." "And were you?" He turned and looked at her directly, the way he always did when a question deserved a direct answer. "I was choosing the work, yes. I told myself it was temporary, that I could make a different choice later, but I knew if I was honest about it that I was going to keep doing this as long as there was this to do, and she deserved to know that, and I gave her uncertainty instead. That was not fair to her. No, Celia agreed. It wasn't. He nodded as if she had confirmed something. It is not a dark past exactly, he said. More of a clarifying failure. She considered this. They had reached the corner of Elm and Second, where Mrs. Aldridge's was half a block further. She stopped and he stopped with her. I am not Rachel Harmon, she said. No, he said. You are not. I came west wearing a dead woman's dress with $60 and nowhere to go, and I found employment and a home in 2 weeks, and I have navigated a potential criminal surveillance situation and given legal testimony in a federal fraud case and taught 22 children to read at a better level than their previous teacher managed. I'm not afraid of dangerous work, because all work worth doing is dangerous. I'm also not asking you to choose anything. I am simply telling you that if you are going to keep looking at me the way you do when you think I am not watching, you should know that I notice, and that I would prefer you to do something about it rather than nothing. Emmett Conroy stood in the December cold with the packed snow under his boots and the sky above him clear and blue and enormous, and he looked at Celia Collins with an expression that was not controlled or measured or carefully professional, and she watched the entirety of his self-possession, which she had spent 3 months learning to read, rearrange itself around something honest and certain and a little terrifying. Celia, he said. Yes, she said. I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd time you came to my office, he said. I did not intend to tell you in the middle of Elm Street in December. I did not give you the choice, she said pleasantly. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, fully and without reserve, and it was a good laugh, deep and genuine and entirely surprised, and she thought that she was going to spend a significant portion of her life trying to earn that laugh. He reached out and took her hand, which was gloved, so it was less immediately intimate than it might have been, but it was still an anchor, still the same quality of weight and warmth as the coat on the platform had been, and she held on to it. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you are willing. I am more than willing, she said, though I should warn you that I have some opinions about what properly means. I expected nothing less, he said. Christmas came and went with the particular warmth of a holiday spent in a place that is becoming home, rather than a place that has always been one. Mrs. Aldridge made an enormous dinner and invited her 5 boarders and Emmett, who brought a bottle of excellent bourbon and a book he had ordered from a catalog for Celia, a collected edition of George Eliot's work that she had mentioned once, in passing, and which he had apparently noted and remembered. She opened it at the dinner table and looked at the inscription he had written inside the front cover, which said only, "For C.C. who sees things accurately. E.C." She looked up from the book and across the table at him, and he looked back at her, and Mrs. Aldridge pretended to be entirely occupied with the potatoes. January brought cold that was serious and intentional, 20 below on the worst nights, and Celia taught in a classroom heated by a wood stove that required constant feeding and produced a warmth that was distributed unevenly and smelled richly of pine. She liked it. She liked the smell and the effort and the children bundled into their coats until they looked like small, opinionated bundles of wool, their faces emerging with an earnestness that she found daily moving. She was teaching them things she wished she had been taught earlier, not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think, how to ask a question with precision, how to hold an idea lightly enough to examine it without dropping it, how to disagree with a source without dismissing it. She also made a point of teaching the children whose parents were the newer settlers, the families who had come from further east and south, including 3 children from a family named Esperanza who had come up from Texas and spoke English as a second language with a fluency that was improving rapidly. She was aware of the injustice of what many of these families faced, the subtle and not subtle ways in which the West's promise of new beginnings was more fully available to some than to others, and she chose daily to do what she could within the scope of her classroom to make the beginning as equal as she could. Emmett came to the schoolhouse one afternoon in late January while the children were working on their arithmetic. He stood in the doorway until she acknowledged him, and she could see from his face that something had happened. She dismissed the children 20 minutes early, which they received with the mixed response of people simultaneously delighted and suspicious, and walked to the door. "The federal case," he said. "Greer pled guilty this morning. Hatch will take the reduced charge. It's over," she breathed. She had not realized how much she had been carrying the weight of its ongoing presence until the weight lifted. "What does that mean for me?" "Nothing more required," he said. "Your testimony was part of the record. You are done." Done, she tested the word internally. The debt that had never existed, the arrangement that had been a trap, Gerald Hatch and Theodore Greer, and the dark machinery of small men with large appetites, all of it resolved, filed, finished. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing it through. Thank you for your testimony," he said. "Without it, the mail fraud charge would have been harder to prove." They stood in the cold doorway of the schoolhouse and looked at each other, and she saw something in his face that was relief, but also something else, something that asked a question he hadn't spoken. "Emmett," she said, "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer honestly and not to protect my feelings if the answer is not what I hope." "I always answer honestly," she said. "It is one of my most inconvenient qualities." "Will you marry me?" The question arrived without preamble, which was exactly the way she would have expected it from him. Direct. No performance. Just the plain fact of what he wanted and the courage to say it. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the dress at the bottom of the carpet bag. She thought about the platform in August, and the shadow falling across the sun, and the coat settling around her shoulders like the first solid thing in weeks. She thought about Celia Collins and the pearl brooch and what her mother would say about a man who listened the way Emmett listened and asked permission, and remembered that she had once mentioned George Eliot. She thought Celia Collins would say, "This is not a mistake, Celia. This is the opposite of one." "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached out and touched her face with one gloved hand, very gently, the way you touch something you are not quite sure you are allowed to have, and she turned her face into his palm and closed her eyes for just a moment and listened to the wind move across the January plains. They were married in April of 1874. The Reverend Macready at the First Methodist Church performed the ceremony, which was attended by Mrs. Aldridge and Ephraim Wade and approximately half the town, because Abilene was a town that showed up for things that meant something, and a schoolteacher marrying the marshal was, by any reasonable measure, something. Celia wore her mother's wedding dress. She had taken it out of the paper wrapping in February and shaken it carefully and hung it in the pale winter light to assess it, and it was beautiful, still luminous, still ivory, still fragrant with the cedar that had preserved it through 26 years of safekeeping. She had let it out slightly at the waist and taken it in slightly at the shoulders and added a new button at the cuff where the original had been lost. And when she put it on in Mrs. Aldridge's room on the morning of the wedding, with Mrs. Aldridge doing the row of tiny buttons up the back with practiced fingers and sniffling in a manner that she would vigorously deny if mentioned, Celia looked at herself in the mirror and thought, "Now I have earned it." She had worn it the first time running from something. She was wearing it the second time running towards something. The difference felt enormous and exactly right. Emmett, standing at the front of the church with Reverend Macready, watched her come up the aisle and made absolutely no attempt to control what happened to his face, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and which she filed away in the same place she kept the first laugh and the inscription in the George Eliot, the private treasury of a man who was not as contained as he appeared. He said his vows in the same direct way he said everything important, without embellishment, with complete sincerity, and with the quality of attention that meant he was saying them to her specifically, not to the assembled room or the reverend or the institution of marriage generally, but to Celia Collins specifically, who had arrived wearing ivory silk and grief and $60, and had become, by some combination of will and circumstance and a coat on a platform in August, the person he was choosing above all other choices. She said hers back in the same way. The reception was in the hotel dining room, the same room where they had eaten their first deliberate supper together in November. And it lasted 4 hours and involved the aforementioned Bourbon, a fiddle player named Prentice who knew more songs than seemed physically possible, dancing that Celia had not expected Emmett to participate in, but which he managed with sufficient competence to save them both from embarrassment, and a wedding cake that Mrs. Aldridge had produced from some corner of her domestic genius that no one had known existed. At some point in the evening, Celia found herself standing near the window with her husband's hand in hers, watching the April night over Abilene, which was warmer than November and smelled of mud and new grass, and the particular Kansas optimism of a prairie coming back to life. "Happy," Emmett said. "Profoundly," she said. He brought their joined hands up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not like him. Public tenderness was something he rationed carefully, and she understood it as the gesture it was, which was a man declaring himself to a woman in the only way he knew how to do it honestly. They moved into a house on Cedar Street that Emmett had been renting and which the landlord, with the goodwill characteristic of small western towns toward their marshals, had agreed to sell on favorable terms. It was a modest house, 5 rooms, a wood stove, a kitchen garden that had been neglected, and which Celia attacked with the same methodical energy she had brought to the schoolroom, and it became, over the following months, one of the best organized and most intellectually busy houses in Abilene. Emmett's books went on the shelves beside Celia's. The George Eliot took its place between a Kansas Land Survey manual and a collected works of Tennyson that had been Emmett's mother's. The pearl brooch hung on a nail near the dressing mirror where Celia could see it every morning. The dress went back into the cedar chest, wrapped in clean muslin, where Celia Collins had always kept it. Summer came, and with it the cattle drives again, and the noise and complexity and occasional violence of Abilene in its commercial season. Emmett worked long hours during the summer months, and Celia was aware of this, managed around it with the practical flexibility she brought to everything, and made sure that, when he was home, he was met with something better than resentment. She was not a woman who required her husband's constant presence. She had built her own life here with her own hands, and it did not collapse when he was absent. What she required was honesty, which she received, and the particular quality of his attention when he was present, which she also received, and a partner in the actual sense of the word, which was what they were becoming. She realized that summer, the happiest she had been in her adult life. Not the happiness of relief or escape, not the diminished happiness of a person who has decided that the absence of pain is enough. The actual, expansive, astonishing happiness of a person who has found the life that fits them and has the wit to know it. She also discovered in August of 1874, exactly 1 year after she had stepped off the train in ivory silk, that she was expecting a child. She told Emmett on a Tuesday evening when he came home from the office and sat down at the kitchen table with the weariness of a man who has spent 12 hours being competent under conditions that did not cooperate. She put a cup of coffee in front of him and sat across from him and said, "I have news." He looked up. She told him. The expression on his face moved through several things very quickly: surprise, something that might have been fear, and then something that she could only describe as the full opening of a door he had kept shut for reasons of self-protection and now chose, deliberately and completely, to open. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. "In the spring, I think." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in both of his with the careful certainty that was his characteristic mode of love. And he said, "Celia," and he could not find the rest of the sentence, which was fine because she did not need it. She put her hand on his face, and he turned into it the same way she had turned into his gloved hand in the January cold. And they stayed like that for a long moment in the kitchen of the Cedar Street house, while the evening light came in sideways and made everything golden and ordinary and entirely sufficient. The pregnancy was uncomplicated. Celia continued teaching until December, when the cold and the logistics of it required her to arrange a substitute, a young woman named Patricia Bell who had some education and enough enthusiasm to manage. And she spent the winter months at home, doing the work of the house with the particular intensity she brought to everything, and reading, and conducting a correspondence with the county superintendent of schools about expanding the curriculum, and receiving visitors with Mrs. Aldridge's regularity and enthusiasm, because Mrs. Aldridge had appointed herself a kind of honorary domestic presence in their lives, and no one had thought of a good reason to argue. The child was born on a March morning in 1875, a boy. They named him James after Emmett's brother, and Emmett held him in the kitchen of the Cedar Street house with the midwife still packing her bag in the next room, and Celia propped against the pillows looking exhausted and triumphant. And his face did the thing it had done when she first told him. All the doors open at once, nothing protected or contained, just a man in the full nakedness of what he felt. "Hello, James," he said to the baby, who was very small and very red and apparently very opinionated, and who settled at the sound of Emmett's voice with the instinctive trust of new creatures. Celia watched them and thought about Celia Collins, who had held her in just this way 25 years ago, and about how the dead are present in the living in ways that are not sad if you allow them not to be, that they persist in the names we choose and the instincts we carry, and the dresses we wear when we are running towards something we do not yet fully understand. She thought her mother would have liked Emmett. Not immediately. Celia Collins had been a careful woman about liking, but eventually, thoroughly, in the way of women who respect other people's ability to be consistently themselves. Spring came back to Abilene, and James Collins Conroy grew with the alarming speed characteristic of babies, who seemed to regard growing as an urgent project requiring their full attention. He was an alert child, dark-eyed like his father, with a quality of focused observation that made the people who came to visit him feel, slightly uncomfortably, that they were the ones being assessed. Celia found this deeply funny and said so often. The school reopened in September with Celia back at the front of the classroom, James in a basket near the wood stove for the first term, which Celia had arranged by the exercise of her particular combination of logic and authority, and which the school council had agreed to by the same route. The children were fascinated by the baby and unusually well-behaved in his vicinity, which Celia suspected had something to do with either genuine tenderness or the awareness that Emmett Conroy was his father, and no one wanted to be reported as unkind by association. The federal case against Greer and Hatch had been fully resolved by early 1875. Greer served 2 years in a federal penitentiary and was released, after which he went to Colorado and was not heard from in Abilene again. Gerald Hatch served 18 months. The debt was formally and permanently canceled, and the documentation confirming Celia Collins's repayment in 1868 was filed with the federal court and a copy sent to Celia, who kept it in the cedar chest beside the dress, because it seemed important to have them together. The dress that had been her inheritance and the document that proved it had not been stolen from her the way they tried. The years moved the way the best years do, not slowly or quickly, but with the rhythmic fullness of a life that is actually being lived. Emmett was appointed chief marshal of the county in 1876, which meant more territory and more responsibility and the same long hours, and he handled it the way he handled all the things he was suited for, which is to say with thoroughness and without drama. Celia was named superintendent of the district school in 1877, which made her one of the very few women in Kansas to hold such a position, and she spent the following years systematically improving the schools of the district with the same methodical intelligence she had once turned on a neglected classroom in August. They had 2 more children. A second son in 1877, who they named Charles after Celia's father, and who arrived with less drama than his brother and immediately set about making up for the deficit by being the loudest person in any room he occupied. And in 1880, a daughter who they named Abilene, and who came into the world in the Cedar Street house on a September morning that smelled of late summer and hot earth, and who had, from the first moment, the quality of composed attention that Celia recognized as characteristic of the Collins women, and which she expected would be a great deal of use to the girl and some degree of inconvenience to everyone else. The cedar chest held the dress through all of it. Celia opened it sometimes, not often, in the private moments between the life she was living and the life she was remembering. She would take the dress out and hold it for a moment, still ivory, still luminous, still carrying the cedar smell that meant preservation and care. And she would think about Celia Collins and the narrow Cincinnati house and the Tuesday in July, and the morning she had put it on the first time because there was nothing else and everything was gone. She would think about Platform 3 in August of 1873 and the ferocious sun, and the particular shame of being stared at for something you could not help and had not chosen. And then the shadow and the stillness of a man who did not need to fill silence to be present in it. And the coat, warm and smelling of work and leather, and the particular human warmth of someone who had been wearing it all day, settling around her shoulders like an answer to a question she had been asking since Cincinnati. She would fold the dress back into the muslin and put it back in the chest, and she would close the cedar chest and go back to her life, which was full and demanding and real and entirely hers. Emmett found her at the chest one evening in the fall of 1881. James was 6, Charles was 4. Celia was 1 year old and asleep in the next room in a crib that Emmett had built with his own hands over the course of 3 determined Sundays. The house on Cedar Street had been expanded twice since their marriage and now had 8 rooms and a proper porch and a kitchen garden that was the envy of the street and had become something of a minor civic institution. He came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at the dress over her shoulder. "Thinking about it," he said. "About her," Celia said, "and about that day, and about how I had no idea what was happening." "Neither did I," he said. "I thought I was there to prevent a crime. I didn't expect—" He paused. "What?" she said. "You," he said simply. "I didn't expect you." She put her hands over his on her shoulders and leaned back against him, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood in the room that smelled of cedar and the deep quiet of a house where children were sleeping and autumn was coming through the window and everything that needed to be resolved had been. "Do you think Celia will want the dress someday?" Celia asked. Emmett thought about this. "She's 1 year old," he said. "She is currently focused on the question of whether the cat or the rug is the most interesting thing in the world." "The cat," Celia said. "She has already decided." "Then she's inherited your decisiveness," he said. "She's inherited yours," Celia said. "She looks at things until she understands them." He held her more tightly. Outside, Abilene was settling into its autumn quiet, the last cattle drives done, the town contracting into its winter self with the comfortable familiarity of something she had watched for 8 years now, 8 cycles of the same rhythm, expansion and contraction, noise and quiet, summer and winter, arrival and staying. She had arrived. She had stayed. The difference between the two was everything she had built since August of 1873, and it was considerable and it was hers. "Emmett," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "I think about that coat sometimes," she said. "On the platform. You gave it to me without saying anything and without asking for anything. And I have thought many times about what it cost you to simply stand there and be present without explaining yourself or requiring gratitude. Most people cannot do that." He was quiet behind her for a moment. "It didn't cost me anything," he said. "You were standing in the sun in a dress that told a whole story and no one was willing to just stand beside it. That seemed wrong." "You are a better man than you know you are," she said. "I know exactly the kind of man I am," he said. "I have been trying to be useful." "You have been," she said. "You are." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she felt it the way she always felt his affection, as something solid and certain and carefully meant, and she closed her eyes and held onto his arms and let the room settle around them. The dress stayed in the chest. Abilene, when she was old enough to understand, was shown it and told the story, not the version that left things out, but the real version, the one with Gerald Hatch and the fabricated debt and the train and the platform and the coat, and the two people who had looked at each other across a depot in August of 1873, and begun the process of becoming the most important thing in each other's lives. Celia Collins Conroy, who was indeed her mother's daughter in the matter of decisiveness and her father's daughter in the matter of observation, listened to the whole story without interruption and then said, "So you wore a dress you hadn't earned yet and got on a train to nowhere and it worked out?" "It worked out," Celia agreed. "Because of the coat," Abilene said. "Because of the man who gave it," Celia said. Abilene looked at her father, who was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and the expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite not a smile, that she had spent her whole life understanding as the face of a man who was more moved than he intended to show. "And you didn't say anything," she said to him. "You just gave it to her." "There was nothing useful to say," Emmett said. "She didn't need words, she needed a coat." Abilene considered this with the focused contemplation of a girl who is storing information against future use. "I think I would have said something anyway," she said. "You would," both her parents said simultaneously and looked at each other over Abilene's head and smiled. The Greer land eventually passed to a legitimate buyer and became a working cattle ranch that ran for decades. Abilene's character continued to change as the cattle trade moved west, becoming more of the town it had always been working toward in its winter selves, quieter, more rooted, more ordinary in the best sense of the word. Emmett served as chief marshal until 1884, when he was offered a position with the federal court in Topeka that meant less personal danger and more reasonable hours, and a salary that better reflected the actual value of the work. He took it after a conversation with Celia that lasted approximately 4 minutes, and arrived at the same conclusion from both directions. They moved to Topeka in the spring of 1884, which was an adjustment and an adventure and, ultimately, a good thing. The house they bought there was larger than Cedar Street, though never quite as right in its proportions. The house you inhabit long enough becomes right regardless of its proportions, and this one became right over the years. James went to university. Charles, who had always been more practically inclined, went to work with a surveying operation and found that the land he had grown up learning to read from his father's maps was something he could make a career of understanding. Abilene studied law, which in 1899 when she began was still an unusual thing for a woman to do, and which she approached with the same fixed certainty she had brought to all her decisions since the question of the cat and the rug. And Celia Collins Conroy continued to teach. She taught in Topeka the way she had taught in Abilene, with the same impatient devotion to minds being opened, and she continued to argue with school boards about curriculum with the same precise authority she had brought to the Abilene Town Council 20 years before, and she continued to win most of the arguments because she was almost always right and had the patience to wait for the evidence to support her. In the spring of 1894, 20 years after their wedding, Emmett came home from the federal court offices with a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who had managed to accomplish something difficult without making noise about it. He put a small box on the kitchen table. Inside was a brooch, not the pearl one, which was still on the nail by the mirror, but a new one. A small enameled frame holding a tiny photograph, and in the photograph were two people on a church porch in April of 1874, the woman in ivory silk with the quality of a person who has arrived at herself, and the man beside her with all his doors open. She looked at it for a long time. "I found the photographer's plate in an estate sale in Abilene," Emmett said. "I had it developed. I thought it was time to have it." She put the brooch in her palm and looked at the two people in it. She was 24 in that photograph. He was 32. They had been married for approximately 3 hours. "Look at us," she said softly. He came and stood beside her and looked at it over her shoulder. "We had no idea," he said, "of what it was going to be." She thought about this. The children and the schools and the Cedar Street house and the Topeka house and the 20 years of Friday suppers and the cedar chest and the dress inside it and James holding onto his father's voice and Abilene choosing the cat and the long dailiness of it, the absolute ordinariness and richness of a life that fits the people living it. "No," she said. "We didn't." She pinned the brooch beside the pearl one the next morning and wore both. The dress was worn one more time. Abilene was married in September of 1905 to a doctor named Henry Ward, who had the particular quality of attention that Celia recognized as the sign of someone who listens in order to understand rather than in order to respond, which she had always considered the most reliable indicator of character. He was a good man. Abilene had chosen wisely, though if you suggested to Abilene that luck had played any part in it, she would refute this with documented evidence. The ceremony was in Topeka. In June, 2 months before the wedding, Abilene came to Celia's room and opened the cedar chest, which had come with them from Abilene like a piece of cargo too important to leave behind, and she looked at the dress for a long time. "It still fits," she said. "There is no way to know until you try," Celia said. It fit. Not perfectly. Abilene was taller than Celia, and the alteration had to account for this. But it fit in the essential way, the way a thing fits when it belongs to a family rather than a person. Celia did the alterations herself, adding 2 inches to the hem with a piece of silk she had saved for years without knowing why. And when she was done, the dress was Abilene Collins's dress and Celia Collins's dress and Abilene Collins Conroy's dress, all at once. And that was exactly as it should be. Emmett walked his daughter down the aisle in September of 1905, and Celia sat in the front pew of the church and watched. And she thought about Abilene Collins, who had worn this dress in 1847 and had spent 26 years keeping it safe in cedar and muslin so that it would be available when it was needed. She had not known, the woman who kept the dress, what it would eventually be needed for. The run from Cincinnati, the platform in Abilene, the second wedding, the real wedding, the one that meant something. And then this one, the third time it would stand in a church and promise something. Things endure, Celia thought, if you wrap them carefully and keep them out of the light and believe in their value even when no one else can see it yet. She felt Emmett's hand find hers in the pew and she held it, and the cedar chest would go back to Topeka, and the dress would go back inside it, and Abilene would add her own muslin and her own cedar and pass it along in her own time, because that was how inheritance worked when it was the good kind, not as a burden transferred, but as a gift continued. They walked out of the church into the September sunshine, all of them, the family that had started on a platform in August of 1873 with a coat and a silence and a woman in ivory silk who had decided to lift her chin and breathe. The sun was enormous over Topeka, and the sky was the blue of something permanent. And Emmett Conroy stood on the church steps with his wife's hand in his and squinted slightly into the light. And Celia stood beside him and thought that the distance between Platform 3 in Abilene and this church step in Topeka was made entirely of choices, hers and his, the small ones and the enormous ones, the choice to take the coat and the choice to hand it, the choice to ask permission and the choice to answer honestly, the choice to stay in a place and build something real out of the materials it offered, which were not always good materials but were honest ones. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. And the dress waited in its cedar and muslin, luminous and patient for whoever came next.